Chernobyl left behind something more dangerous than an abandoned city. Some of the objects found there look completely harmless. You could walk past them without ever realizing they were radioactive. Others are pieces of Reactor 4 itself, frozen in place after the explosion, still dangerous decades later. And then there are the things investigators found in places that were never supposed to be entered again. The deeper they went into Chernobyl, the worse the discoveries became, and some of them are still there today. 1. The elephant's foot deep. Beneath the destroyed Reactor 4, investigators encountered something that looked almost disappointingly ordinary, a dark wrinkled mass sitting on the floor. It became known as the elephant's foot. But this wasn't rock. During the 1986 disaster, nuclear fuel, concrete, sand, steel, and other reactor materials reached extreme temperatures and melted together. The mixture flowed through the ruined building before cooling into a lava-like radioactive material called corium. The elephant's foot became its most famous formation, and studying it was anything but routine. The International Atomic Energy Agency reports that researchers collected samples of Chernobyl's lava under extremely dangerous conditions. Some scientists involved in sampling work accumulated doses of several sieverts, and individual sampling operations could deliver enormous radiation exposure. The first samples from the elephant's foot were collected in 1987. Imagine finding something that resembles cooled construction debris, then realizing you're looking at the solidified remains of a nuclear reactor core. Chernobyl had created its own kind of rock, and getting close to it came with a price. 2. The firefighters' clothing. One of Chernobyl's most frightening discoveries wasn't hidden inside Reactor 4. It was underneath a hospital. In the hours after the explosion, firefighters and plant workers were brought to Hospital Number 126 in Pripyat. Many had rushed toward the burning reactor without understanding the scale of the radiation around them. Their contaminated clothing was removed during treatment, and boots, helmets, gloves, and other items were left in the hospital basement. Decades later, those objects were still there. They look like ordinary, abandoned work clothes. That's what makes them so disturbing. There's no green glow, no movie-style warning, just dusty equipment lying in darkness. But measurements taken years afterward still found dangerously elevated radiation around items associated with the first responders. The clothes had essentially become radioactive artifacts of the first night, and that basement tells the story better than any photograph of the ruined reactor. The firefighters walked into something they couldn't see, smell, or hear. Then they unknowingly carried part of it back with them. 3. Pieces of the reactor were blown outside. The explosion at Reactor 4 was violent enough to turn parts of a nuclear reactor into debris scattered across the surrounding site. And some of that debris wasn't ordinary rubble. According to an IAEA account of the accident, the explosion destroyed the reactor building and threw fragments of nuclear fuel into the immediate environment. One fuel assembly was reportedly discovered roughly 1,600 meters from the reactor. Other portions of the fuel melted with surrounding materials and flowed through the damaged building before solidifying into radioactive lava. Think about what that meant for the people arriving that night. A chunk lying on the ground might look like concrete or burned industrial debris, but some fragments around the destroyed unit came directly from one of the most radioactive places imaginable. There was no dramatic glow telling you which piece was dangerous. That is part of what made Chernobyl terrifying. The landscape could look almost normal while radiation levels were anything but normal. The IAEA notes that some off-site locations reached dose rates capable of producing severe effects after only hours of exposure. After the explosion, even the ground itself had become something you couldn't completely trust. 4. The Red Forest. Just west of the power plant sits a forest with a name that sounds like it belongs in a horror movie: the Red Forest. Unfortunately, the real explanation is worse. When Reactor 4 exploded, enormous amounts of radioactive material fell across the surrounding landscape. A pine forest close to the plant received such intense radiation that many trees died and turned reddish-brown, giving the area its famous name. But the dead forest didn't simply disappear. During the cleanup, workers buried contaminated trees, vegetation, and topsoil in trenches. According to research cataloged by the International Atomic Energy Agency, roughly 1 million cubic meters of radioactive material were placed in about 200 subsurface trenches in the Red Forest area. The trenches were covered with sand, and vegetation was planted over them. So, beneath what looks like an ordinary patch of woodland lies part of the physical aftermath of the disaster. That may be the creepiest thing about Chernobyl. Nature returned. Trees grew again. birds came back. But underneath the new forest, the old radioactive forest is still buried. 5. The robots that Chernobyl defeated. After the explosion, the roofs around Reactor 4 were covered with dangerously radioactive debris. Someone had to remove it before construction of the protective shelter could continue. The obvious solution was robots. Machines were brought in because sending people onto those roofs was incredibly dangerous. Remote-controlled equipment attempted to push and remove radioactive material while operators stayed farther away. Then, Chernobyl presented another problem. Some machines simply couldn't cope with the extreme conditions. Historical accounts describe robots becoming unusable in areas of intense radiation, forcing cleanup crews to rely on human workers instead. These men became famously known as biorobots. Their job was terrifyingly simple: run onto contaminated sections of roof, throw pieces of radioactive debris away, and get back out as quickly as possible. Think about that for a moment. The radiation was so severe that machines intended to replace humans could fail. And when the technology couldn't finish the job, the backup plan wasn't a better robot. The backup plan was people. 6. Radioactive waste was buried beneath the zone. Some of the strangest things discovered around Chernobyl aren't sitting inside abandoned buildings. They're underground. After the accident, cleanup crews faced an enormous problem. The disaster hadn't contaminated only Reactor 4. Radioactive material had spread across soil, vegetation, equipment, construction materials, and countless objects used during the cleanup. You couldn't simply load everything into garbage trucks and take it to the nearest landfill. So, contaminated material was collected, isolated, stored, and in some areas buried. The Red Forest alone contained around 200 subsurface trenches holding contaminated soil and dead vegetation. Researchers have continued studying these sites because radionuclides can move through soil and groundwater over time, and the problem never completely went away. The Chernobyl nuclear power plant still officially classifies waste from the 1986 accident and its cleanup as radioactive waste requiring controlled management. That's what makes the exclusion zone different from an ordinary abandoned place. Sometimes the dangerous thing isn't the ruined building in front of you. It's what was buried underneath your feet decades ago. 7. The vehicles that became radioactive. Waste. The cleanup of Chernobyl required an extraordinary amount of machinery. Trucks carried materials, military vehicles transported workers, bulldozers moved contaminated earth, specialized machines operated around the damaged plant. But there was an ugly problem. Equipment working in contaminated areas could itself become contaminated. That meant some machinery couldn't simply return to normal service when the cleanup ended. Decontamination was attempted where possible, while other equipment became part of the enormous radioactive waste problem created by the accident. For years, photographs from the exclusion zone showed collections of abandoned vehicles associated with the cleanup, rows of trucks and machines slowly rusting away. And that image captures something important about Chernobyl. Radiation didn't need to destroy a machine mechanically to make it useless. A truck could still have 4 wheels, an engine could still work, a bulldozer could look perfectly repairable. But if radioactive contamination couldn't be reduced to acceptable levels, that perfectly recognizable piece of machinery had become something completely different: waste. Chernobyl didn't just leave behind a ruined reactor. It created an entire category of objects that looked usable, but could no longer be treated as ordinary things. 8. The radioactive fuel hidden inside the ruins. The elephant's foot wasn't the only strange material created inside Reactor 4. When the reactor was destroyed, nuclear fuel and structural materials were heated to extraordinary temperatures. Some of that material melted together and moved through the damaged building before cooling into bizarre solid formations. Scientists call these materials fuel-containing materials, and some took the form of hardened radioactive lava. Imagine molten reactor fuel mixing with concrete, sand, metals, and other material inside a collapsing industrial building. Then imagine that mixture flowing through rooms and corridors before finally cooling wherever gravity left it. That's essentially what investigators later had to examine. And these formations didn't come in convenient laboratory samples. They existed inside a badly damaged, highly radioactive structure that workers had desperately sealed beneath the original shelter. Even today, managing radioactive material connected with the destroyed reactor remains part of the official work at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. The elephant's foot became famous because it photographs well. But it wasn't a lonely monster. It was one piece of an entire radioactive landscape created inside the ruins. Nuclear fuel transformed into something that looked disturbingly like ordinary stone. 9. The hot particles. Hidden in the soil. Some of the most terrifying things released from Chernobyl were almost too small to see. Scientists found what became known as hot particles, microscopic fragments containing unusually high concentrations of radioactive material. Some were actual pieces of nuclear fuel thrown into the environment when Reactor 4 was destroyed. And there were a lot of them. The International Atomic Energy Agency reports that researchers found areas inside the 30-kilometer exclusion zone containing up to 100,000 fuel particles per square meter. Some particles were smaller than a grain of dust, while others reached hundreds of micrometers in size. That means Chernobyl's danger wasn't limited to giant pieces of reactor debris or obvious contaminated machinery. It could be sitting in the dirt. Researchers studying the aftermath found that many fuel particles remained close to the surface for years. Imagine walking through a quiet field where nothing looks unusual. Grass moves in the wind, trees stand nearby. Everything appears completely normal. Meanwhile, tiny fragments of a destroyed nuclear reactor may still be mixed into the soil beneath your shoes. At Chernobyl, sometimes the smallest discoveries were the ones you really didn't want to bring home. 10. An entire village was buried. A few kilometers from the power plant stood the small village of Kopachi. After the disaster, it became so contaminated that authorities didn't simply evacuate it. They destroyed much of it. Houses were bulldozed, and the remains were buried beneath the ground. Today, instead of streets lined with village homes, visitors find an eerie landscape of vegetation and raised earth where buildings once stood. The village kindergarten, built from more durable materials, became one of the best-known structures left behind. The basic fact that Kopachi was leveled and buried is well documented, including in recent reporting about families displaced from the area. And there's something deeply unsettling about the idea. When we picture an abandoned village, we imagine empty houses, broken windows, furniture covered in dust. Kopachi is different. Much of the village isn't standing there waiting to be explored. It's underneath you. Homes where families ate dinner, slept, argued, celebrated birthdays, and planned their futures were reduced to contaminated debris and covered with earth. Chernobyl didn't merely empty this place. In a very literal sense, the disaster helped erase it from the surface. 11. The reactor was sealed. Inside a giant tomb. After Reactor 4 exploded, workers faced a problem almost impossible to imagine. They had a destroyed nuclear reactor sitting open to the environment. So, during the months after the accident, crews constructed an enormous concrete and steel structure around the ruins. It became known as the shelter, or more famously, the sarcophagus. And that name was frighteningly appropriate. Inside remained the wreckage of Reactor 4, radioactive materials, fuel-containing masses, contaminated dust, and structures damaged by the explosion and fire. The original shelter was built quickly under extremely difficult conditions. Decades later, engineers worried about its long-term stability. The solution was extraordinary: build another enormous structure and place it over the first one. The new safe confinement is roughly 110 meters high, 257 meters wide, and 162 meters long. It was assembled away from Reactor 4 to reduce workers' radiation exposure, then moved into position over the old shelter. So, Chernobyl's most dangerous building eventually received a second shell, a tomb built around a tomb. And inside both of them, the remains of Reactor 4 are still there. 12. More than 200 tons of uranium were left in the wreckage. The explosion destroyed Reactor 4, but it didn't make its nuclear fuel magically disappear. According to the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the damaged reactor and original shelter contained a horrifying mixture created during the accident. Approximately 5,000 metric tons of sand, lead, and boric acid dropped during the emergency response, mixed with more than 200 tons of uranium, forming lava-like material inside the ruins. Some of that material became the strange fuel-containing formations we mentioned earlier. But think about the scale. 200 tons isn't something you carry away in a few protective containers. It's an industrial quantity of nuclear material trapped inside the wreckage of an exploded reactor. That's one reason Chernobyl never became simply an abandoned power station. Decades after the accident, engineers are still planning how damaged structures can eventually be dismantled and radioactive materials managed safely. The enormous new safe confinement was designed partly to make that work possible. The explosion happened in seconds. Cleaning up what those seconds created is measured in generations. Chernobyl may look frozen in 1986. Its biggest problem definitely isn't. 13. They built one of the largest movable structures on Earth. At some point, engineers looked at Chernobyl's crumbling radioactive shelter and apparently decided the reasonable solution was to build something large enough to swallow the entire thing. That's basically what happened. The result was the new safe confinement, an enormous steel arch designed to cover Reactor 4 and the original sarcophagus. It weighs roughly 36,000 tons and spans about 257 meters. The structure was so enormous that it couldn't simply be assembled directly over the reactor. Radiation exposure would have made that approach far more difficult for workers, so engineers built the arch nearby. Then, in 2016, they moved the gigantic structure approximately 327 meters into its final position over Reactor 4. Picture that operation. You're not moving a bridge section or a large warehouse. You're sliding a steel structure big enough to cover the remains of a nuclear power station. And once it arrived, the job still wasn't finished. The arch contains remotely operated equipment intended to help dismantle unstable structures and handle radioactive material. Chernobyl created a problem so enormous that humanity eventually had to build a building over another building just to start taking it apart. 14. The sarcophagus was never meant to be the final solution. From the outside, the original Chernobyl sarcophagus looked permanent: huge walls, tons of concrete, steel beams surrounding the shattered reactor. But it was built during an emergency. Workers constructed the shelter in 1986 under conditions that would make an ordinary construction project look like assembling furniture in your living room. The site was radioactive, the reactor building was badly damaged, and crews needed to isolate the wreckage as quickly as possible. That urgency created a long-term problem. The structure aged, and some parts became unstable. Engineers couldn't simply walk inside with hard hats and start repairing everything normally. The radioactive inventory of Reactor 4 was still there. That's why the new safe confinement wasn't designed merely as a giant rain cover. Its purpose includes containing radioactive material while creating conditions for remotely dismantling the unstable original shelter. And the project gives Chernobyl an unsettling quality unlike most ruins. Usually, abandoned buildings slowly collapse, and nobody cares. Here, engineers spent decades making sure one particular ruin doesn't collapse. Because when the building you're protecting contains the remains of a destroyed nuclear reactor, let nature take its course is not an acceptable maintenance plan. 15. The machines inside the new arch are designed to work where humans shouldn't. When engineers designed the new safe confinement, they understood something very clearly. Eventually, somebody would have to dismantle parts of the old sarcophagus. They also understood that sending workers directly into every contaminated area would be a terrible idea. So the enormous arch was equipped with remotely controlled machinery and cranes designed to operate above the ruined reactor. The EBRD describes these systems as essential for the long-term dismantling of unstable structures and management of radioactive material inside. That creates one of the strangest industrial workplaces on Earth. Beneath the giant steel arch sits the original sarcophagus. Inside that sits the wreckage of Reactor 4. And somewhere inside that wreckage remain radioactive fuel-containing materials created during the disaster. The machines overhead exist, partly because certain jobs below them are better performed from a distance. There is an eerie symmetry to it. Back in 1986, some robots sent into extremely radioactive areas failed, and humans had to perform dangerous cleanup work. Decades later, engineers returned with vastly more sophisticated remote technology. Because Chernobyl taught the world a brutally simple lesson. Sometimes the safest way to enter a room is to make sure a human being never has to enter it at all. 16. More than 21,000 spent nuclear fuel assemblies. Reactor 4 gets almost all the attention, but Chernobyl had another enormous radioactive problem waiting nearby. More than 21,000 spent nuclear fuel assemblies remained from reactors 1, 2, and 3. These weren't pieces of the destroyed reactor. They were fuel assemblies that had actually been used in the other RBMK reactors before those units were permanently shut down. For years, the fuel was kept underwater in an aging storage facility at the Chernobyl site. And spent doesn't mean harmless. Spent nuclear fuel remains highly radioactive and must be isolated, cooled, monitored, and protected. That's why an entirely new facility, called ISF-2, was constructed to deal with it. The fuel is transported there, processed, dried, and sealed inside double-walled canisters before being placed into concrete storage modules. The facility is designed to store it safely for at least 100 years. Just think about that number again. 21,000 fuel assemblies. Chernobyl's most famous reactor exploded in 1986, but decades later, workers were still dealing with enough radioactive material from the other reactors to require one of the largest dry spent fuel storage facilities ever built. 17. The radioactive liquid that had to be turned into solid waste. Not everything dangerous at Chernobyl came in the form of twisted metal or strange black lava. Some of it was liquid. Years of operating the power plant, followed by the accident and enormous cleanup operation, created radioactive liquid waste that couldn't simply be poured away and forgotten. So, engineers built a dedicated liquid radioactive waste treatment plant at Chernobyl. Its job sounds almost like something from science fiction. Take radioactive liquid and convert it into a stable, solid form that can be packaged and stored more safely. The EBRD lists the plant as one of the major nuclear safety projects created at the Chernobyl site. And that's what makes this discovery so unsettling. When most people imagine nuclear waste, they picture glowing barrels from an old movie. Reality is much less theatrical. It can be contaminated water and chemical mixtures sitting inside industrial systems, requiring specialized equipment just to transform them into something safer to handle. At Chernobyl, even the liquid waste needed its own factory. The explosion lasted only moments. The garbage it created came in almost every form imaginable. 18. Radioactive dust is still one of the things engineers fear. A collapsed building normally creates dust. At Reactor 4, dust can be something far more serious. Inside the old shelter are damaged structures and radioactive materials left from the 1986 accident. If unstable sections are dismantled carelessly, contaminated particles can potentially become airborne. That's one reason the new safe confinement is much more than an enormous steel roof. It was designed to create a controlled environment around the destroyed reactor, while engineers eventually dismantle unstable structures and deal with radioactive material inside. Its confinement and ventilation systems help prevent contamination from escaping into the outside environment. Think about how strange that is. A piece of steel weighing several tons looks frightening. Dust doesn't. You can barely see it. But when that dust comes from the remains of a destroyed nuclear reactor, keeping it contained becomes an engineering problem requiring a structure 257 meters wide. Chernobyl keeps reversing normal logic. The giant steel arch is there partly because of things small enough to float through the air. Sometimes the most dangerous thing inside a building isn't what can fall on you. It's what you can accidentally breathe. 1993. Fuel assemblies went into the first canister. When engineers finally began transferring Chernobyl's spent nuclear fuel into its new storage facility, the first fully loaded canister contained something extraordinary. Inside were 93 spent fuel assemblies, all in one container. The operation took place in 2020 as part of testing for ISF-2, the massive facility created to handle more than 21,000 assemblies from Chernobyl's reactors 1, 2, and 3. The process isn't simply put fuel in box. The assemblies must be transported from the old storage facility, processed, cut, dried, packaged inside specially designed double-walled canisters, and then placed into concrete storage modules. In total, 232 canisters are intended to hold the fuel for at least 100 years. There's something strangely intimidating about seeing nuclear cleanup reduced to numbers. 93 assemblies in one canister, 232 canisters, more than 21,000 assemblies altogether, and a century of planned storage. Most containers have instructions like keep dry or this side up. These containers come with a slightly more serious requirement. Keep what is inside safely isolated from the world until almost everyone currently alive is gone. 20. 5,000 tons of material were dropped onto the burning reactor. In the chaotic days after the explosion, helicopters flew directly over the destroyed Reactor 4. Their crews were attempting to control an accident nobody had ever faced on this scale. Thousands of tons of materials were dropped onto the reactor from above. According to the EBRD, approximately 5,000 metric tons of sand, lead, and boric acid used during the emergency response eventually became mixed with more than 200 tons of uranium inside the destroyed unit. Some of that mixture contributed to the strange lava-like radioactive material later discovered inside. So when investigators eventually entered parts of Reactor 4, they weren't looking at the remains of a normal reactor anymore. They were looking at something created by an explosion, extreme heat, nuclear fuel, building materials, and thousands of tons of substances thrown in during a desperate attempt to control the disaster. It's almost geological. Except geology normally takes millions of years. Chernobyl manufactured its own bizarre radioactive landscape in days. Concrete became rubble. Fuel became lava-like masses. Emergency materials became part of the wreckage. The cleanup didn't simply cover the disaster. In places, it physically fused with it. 21. The shelter contained structures engineers were afraid could collapse. One of the most frightening discoveries at Chernobyl wasn't radioactive fuel. It was something much more familiar: a damaged building. The original shelter was constructed rapidly around Reactor 4 in 1986. It contained the wreckage, but parts of the structure remained unstable. Over the following decades, engineers faced an uncomfortable possibility. Sections could eventually collapse. At an ordinary abandoned factory, that would be a demolition problem. At Chernobyl, a major collapse could disturb radioactive material and contaminated dust inside the shelter. So before the new safe confinement could solve the larger problem, engineers had to stabilize parts of the old structure. The EBRD describes extensive work strengthening the shelter, including stabilization of its western wall and transferring roof loads onto new supporting structures. Only then could the enormous new arch provide the controlled space needed for future dismantling. That's the nightmare hidden inside Chernobyl's engineering. You have radioactive wreckage inside an unstable building. You can't simply knock the building down because of the radioactive wreckage. And reaching the wreckage safely requires protecting the building you eventually want to dismantle. Chernobyl isn't one problem. It's a Russian nesting doll of problems, except every doll requires radiation monitoring. 22. Water was found. Inside the ruined reactor fire wasn't the only thing engineers had to worry about inside Reactor 4. There was water. Over the years, rain and condensation entered parts of the original shelter. Water could collect in rooms containing radioactive dust and fuel-containing materials, creating contaminated liquid inside an already dangerous structure. That sounds like a plumbing problem until you remember what's sitting in the building. The Chernobyl nuclear power plant reports that roughly 95% of the reactor's original fuel remained inside the shelter in different forms, including fragments of the reactor core, lava-like material, radioactive dust, and tiny fuel particles. Water interacting with this material had to be monitored because it could carry dissolved radionuclides through the structure. Fortunately, long-term monitoring reported no evidence that uranium or plutonium from these internal waters was spreading downstream through groundwater outside the shelter. But the image remains deeply unsettling. Imagine rain entering a ruined building. Now imagine that building contains the remains of a nuclear reactor. At Chernobyl, even a puddle isn't automatically just a puddle. Sometimes it's water that has spent years slowly moving through one of the most radioactive ruins humans have ever created. 23. Scientists found new uranium minerals growing inside Chernobyl. The material inside Reactor 4 didn't simply cool down in 1986 and remain frozen forever. It continued changing. The Chernobyl nuclear power plant describes several different forms of fuel-containing material still present inside the shelter. There are fragments of the original reactor core. There are lava-like masses created when fuel melted together with other materials. There is radioactive dust. And then there's something especially strange: secondary uranium minerals. These crystalline formations developed as uranium-bearing fuel-containing materials slowly interacted with water and the surrounding environment. In other words, entirely new mineral structures began forming inside the wreckage. Think about how bizarre that is. The explosion destroyed a nuclear reactor. Extreme temperatures created artificial radioactive lava. Water later moved through parts of that material, allowing chemical processes to continue long after the fires were gone. And decades later, scientists aren't simply studying debris. They're watching the debris transform. Chernobyl has become something between an industrial ruin, a nuclear waste site, and an accidental geological laboratory. The reactor died in 1986, but chemically, parts of what it left behind are still changing. 24. About 2,000 tons of combustible material were inside the shelter. You'd think one fire would have been enough. Apparently, Reactor 4 didn't get that memo. According to information published by the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, around 2,000 tons of combustible materials were present inside the original shelter. These included graphite, electrical cables, plastic materials, and wooden structures. Yes, wood. Inside the structure built around the remains of the world's most infamous nuclear reactor accident. The danger wasn't that these materials were secretly waiting to recreate the 1986 disaster. The destroyed reactor was in a completely different condition, but fire remained a serious concern because burning contaminated materials could disturb radioactive dust and complicate an already hazardous environment. And dust is something Chernobyl has plenty of. The plant has reported that radioactive aerosols inside the shelter include particles created during the original accident, as well as material produced by the gradual physical and chemical degradation of fuel-containing masses. So, picture the situation. You have radioactive dust, you have damaged structures, and you have thousands of tons of material capable of burning. Chernobyl somehow managed to make the phrase fire safety inspection sound genuinely terrifying. 25. Radioactive waste was buried in unlined trenches. After the explosion, cleanup crews had a straightforward problem with no straightforward solution. What do you do with an entire landscape covered in radioactive material? One answer was brutally simple: dig holes. In 1987, contaminated soil, vegetation, debris, and dead trees from the Red Forest were bulldozed into shallow trenches near the power plant. An International Atomic Energy Agency report estimated that approximately 1 million cubic meters of contaminated waste were placed into trenches and mounds only a few meters deep. And many of those trenches weren't lined. At the time, scientists expected radioactive fuel particles in the waste to remain relatively stable. Nature had other plans. Later monitoring found that some fuel particles gradually weathered and dissolved. Groundwater levels also rose, flooding some burial areas and increasing concerns about radionuclides moving through the environment. Researchers subsequently identified contamination moving away from individual trenches, including strontium-90 transported through groundwater. So, beneath parts of the Red Forest lies an enormous radioactive time capsule. No dramatic concrete bunker, no giant steel door, just contaminated material buried beneath sandy soil. It's difficult to imagine a more Chernobyl solution. When the surface became dangerous, they literally put part of the disaster underground. 26. Some dogs living near the plant carry radioactive cesium. Chernobyl has dogs, hundreds of them. Free-roaming dog populations live around the exclusion zone, including surprisingly close to the nuclear power plant itself. Scientists studying these animals discovered something you definitely wouldn't expect from an ordinary veterinary examination: radioactive cesium. A 2-year study measured both external contamination and internal cesium-137 in dogs near the plant. Of 288 animals checked for external beta contamination, 21 showed significant removable contamination. Researchers also measured internal cesium-137 concentrations, ranging from undetectable levels to approximately 30,000 becquerels per kilogram in some animals. Importantly, the researchers concluded that the external contamination wasn't high enough to create a major hazard from casual human contact. But the findings show how radionuclides can continue moving through a living ecosystem decades after the accident. These aren't mutant movie monsters, they're dogs. They form families, move between locations, search for food, and live around buildings constructed to contain nuclear waste. And that's somehow stranger than science fiction. The most haunting animals at Chernobyl aren't glowing wolves with 3 heads. They're completely recognizable dogs carrying an invisible chemical signature of a disaster that happened before they were born. 27. Scientists found 3 distinct populations of Chernobyl dogs. When scientists began studying Chernobyl's dogs genetically, they discovered something unexpected. The animals weren't simply one giant population wandering randomly around the exclusion zone. Researchers analyzed the genomes of 302 free-roaming dogs living at the nuclear power plant in Chernobyl City and farther away. They found 3 genetically distinct populations. Even more surprisingly, dogs living around the power plant were genetically different from those living only about 16 kilometers away in Chernobyl City. Researchers also identified 15 family groups, including one large family whose relatives appeared across multiple locations inside the exclusion zone. That means these dogs have been forming their own multi-generational communities in the shadow of the disaster. But there's an important warning here. Scientists have not proven that radiation turned these dogs into some new super-resistant Chernobyl breed. Later research investigating whether radiation-induced mutations explained their genetic differences did not find evidence supporting that simple explanation. Reality is more interesting anyway. Chernobyl didn't create radioactive mutant dogs. It created an abandoned human landscape where ordinary dogs continued breeding, migrating, and building family lines beside a destroyed nuclear power plant. Sometimes survival is stranger than mutation. 28. Tiny worms were living in highly radioactive areas. If you were searching for survivors inside the Chernobyl exclusion zone, microscopic worms probably wouldn't be your first guess. Scientists had other ideas. Researchers collected nearly 300 nematode worms from different locations across the zone, including areas with widely varying radiation levels. They then cultured the animals and sequenced genomes from selected strains. The obvious question was fascinating. Had decades of radiation permanently changed them? The answer turned out to be surprisingly complicated. A 2024 study found no evidence that worms collected from more radioactive locations had systematically accumulated more mutations across their genomes. The researchers also tested their resistance to DNA-damaging chemicals and found differences between strains, but those differences weren't predicted by radiation levels where the worms had been collected. That's an important reminder of how strange Chernobyl really is. Radiation can damage DNA. That's established science. But ecosystems don't behave like horror movies. You can't walk into the zone, find an unusual animal, and automatically declare it a mutant. These tiny worms had spent generations in one of Earth's most famous contaminated landscapes. And their genomes refused to deliver the simple monster story everyone expected. 29. Scientists found wolves thriving in the exclusion zone. Chernobyl's abandoned landscape eventually attracted something much larger than worms: wolves. After people left much of the exclusion zone, forests and wildlife reclaimed huge areas once dominated by villages, farms, roads, and industry. Wolves became one of the most dramatic symbols of that return, but scientists aren't studying them simply because they look impressive walking through abandoned Soviet landscapes. They're studying what decades of environmental contamination may be doing to their bodies. Research on Chernobyl wildlife has found that radiation exposure can produce biological stress and genetic effects, although the scale varies greatly between species, locations, and individual animals. More recent work on wolves has investigated immune function and possible signs of natural selection in populations living under chronic exposure. That doesn't mean Chernobyl created radioactive superwolves. The evidence is far more complicated than that, and that's precisely what makes the discovery interesting. These animals are living, hunting, reproducing, and moving through a landscape humans abandoned because it became too contaminated for normal life. We built the exclusion zone to keep people out. The wolves apparently saw the empty forests and decided we'd finally improve the neighborhood. 30. A claw used. During the cleanup is still radioactive. Among Chernobyl's strangest relics is something that looks like it belongs on an ordinary construction site: a large mechanical grab, often called the claw. Equipment like this was used during the cleanup to move contaminated material after the explosion. The problem was simple. When machinery handled radioactive debris, the machinery itself could become contaminated. The claw survived. For years, it became one of the more notorious objects associated with the abandoned machinery around the zone. Radiation surveys have found elevated readings on it, which is why visitors were repeatedly warned not to climb on it or treat it like a giant playground prop. And honestly, without a radiation meter, you'd never know. It's rusty, heavy, industrial, exactly the kind of forgotten equipment you'd expect behind an abandoned factory. That's what makes it frightening. Chernobyl produced objects that could look completely harmless while carrying contamination from work performed around Reactor 4. The claw doesn't glow. It doesn't hum ominously. It simply sits there. A piece of old machinery that helped clean up radioactive material and became part of the radioactive story itself. Chernobyl proves the scariest things don't need ghosts. Sometimes they just need a Geiger counter. Which discovery disturbed you most? Tell me below and subscribe, because history has plenty more places we probably shouldn't touch.